Nancy Pelosi just lost complete control in a hearing room, and it took only 15 seconds for her 40-year legacy to systematically unravel. What subsequently unfolded inside that congressional chamber was a total demolition, executed through the clinical, devastating vocabulary of unsealed intelligence briefs. It would require 40 torturous minutes for Nancy Pelosi to lose her speaking rhythm. It took 43 minutes for her steady hands to start shaking. However, it demanded precisely 15 seconds at the very dawn of the session to commit the catastrophic error that triggered the entire avalanche. She arrogantly marched into the space speaking when she desperately needed to walk in listening. Director Gabbard, with all due respect, Nancy Pelosi initiated. The fake grin she plastered across her face was the exact expression she had weaponized over 4 decades, a tactic of informing citizens they were totally misguided while superficially praising them. You have defended this nation with honor. The entire populace appreciates your military duty. But wearing a uniform does not equate to actual comprehension. She pivoted a quarter-inch toward the broadcasting lenses, targeting the citizens observing that morning on the monitors inside their homes in Ohio, Idaho, and the Carolinas. I would blatantly state that the rural fiction surrounding Washington possesses zero connection to the brutal reality of ruling. The heavy lifting I have accomplished, the grind my peers have executed, the legislative force that has kept this democracy standing, while troops like the director, regardless of their courage, were deployed in foreign lands. The calm before the storm Tulsi Gabbard utterly refused to snap back immediately. She remained anchored at the testimony desk, wearing a stark charcoal suit, with a slim, crimson binder shut completely flat before her. Both palms rested motionless on the cover. A modest pair of service ribbons sat pinned, miniature and silent, to her collar. They served as the absolute only visual detail referencing the war zones she had endured prior to entering this political theater. She carried the rigid, undeniable presence of a combat commander who had previously held strict attention far longer than this pathetic introductory monologue. Standing in blistering heat, gripping a loaded rifle, she was not distracted. She was waiting. When she ultimately projected her voice, her tone was lethal, pristine, and perfectly measured. It carried the calculated rhythm of an intelligence operative decoding a threat. Madam Speaker, you just vocalized 3 distinct claims. You stated that military duty does not equal comprehension. You claimed the citizens watching from their homes exist inside a rural fiction. And you arrogantly declared that soldiers exactly like myself were absent, while the supposedly authentic labor got accomplished. She ripped the crimson binder open to its initial document. The thick ink of a federal declassification marker slashed diagonally across the header. The severe text reading "Top Secret" had been violently struck out with one definitive, relentless line. I will systematically dismantle each of those ignorant claims in sequence, utilizing hard evidence. I refuse to elevate my volume. I will not require it. The destruction occurring this morning exists purely on paper. She planted her palm violently flat on the exposed document. July of 2017. You are standing directly at a microphone on the Capitol stairs. You are operating as the designated leader of the House Democratic faction, and you declare to the American public, and I am citing your precise words, that the intelligence agencies have, quote, spoken unequivocally regarding the matter of foreign interference. Do you recall uttering that lie, Madam Speaker? Pelosi's hand refused to flinch just yet. The Grand Conductor's right palm remained in sheer authority, hovering precisely at the height of her jawline. I recall guiding my coalition through a brutal era for this republic, handling it with the severe gravity it demanded, Director, which fails to address the actual question I posed. It is a straightforward yes or no. Did you publicly state the intelligence sector had spoken with absolutely no doubt? Yes or no? Yes, within the tight parameters of a specific time frame where I appreciate that. Tulsi aggressively flipped to the next sheet. Then, I will hold you to your exact phrasing, Madam Speaker. Before this session concludes, I am going to expose to this room what those intelligence agents actually documented in ink. Right. While you were manipulating the public into believing they had zero doubts, I will expose a corrupt intelligence pipeline you commanded. I will detail how your hand-picked committee was busted, orchestrating a narrative beforehand. I will expose a vicious character assassination against a U.S. combat veteran. A lie you possessed every chance to terminate with a single breath, yet intentionally refused to. And when the dust settles, I am going to drop a specific digit. She stopped speaking, letting the silence hang just long enough to ensure the entire chamber felt the calculated weight of the pause. 70? The grin on Pelosi's face suddenly masked something far darker. Her brain frantically started recalibrating. When a definitive moment like this erupts, permanently etching a paper trail into a decades-long political career, the devastating impact resonates through the entire Capitol. We are barely scratching the surface of the first document. In the back rows, 11 men and women clad in unbranded, dark business suits sat unnervingly still. They were all military veterans, though absolutely nothing in their attire broadcasted that fact. They had traveled there for one sole objective, and were not yet positive they would need to take any action beyond simply observing. For the absolute first time that morning, Nancy Pelosi's right hand drifted sluggishly downward to the leather-bound memoir resting near her elbow, and heavily planted itself there. The blueprint of deception Carter Page is absolutely not the reason I am sitting in this chair, Madam Speaker. Tulsi fired back. He was merely the convenient scapegoat for someone else's agenda. The far more brutal reality is what transpired inside the locked rooms, where the actual intelligence assessments were being forged. So, that is precisely where I intend to begin. She yanked out the second document. The declassification block across the top was heavy and freshly stamped. In December of 2016, and bleeding into January of 2017, a tight-knit squad of analysts at the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI were aggressively tasked with generating what we designate as an intelligence community assessment. It serves as the most authoritative, unclassified document the intelligence apparatus produces. It is fundamentally designed to represent the unified, analytical verdict of three separate agencies. She read the damning text straight from the page. This is an internal, leaked email authored by one of those exact analysts, time-stamped the 4th of January, 2017. The agent explicitly complains, and I am directly quoting, that the underlying tradecraft does not support the level of confidence senior leadership has requested be assigned to the central judgment. She locked eyes with Pelosi, translating the bureaucratic jargon into plain, brutal English. Madam Speaker, they were being strictly ordered what conclusions to fabricate before they had even finished conducting the investigation. A visible shockwave ripped through the journalist tables. This was not an isolated grievance from one disgruntled worker. There are 7 identical complaints documented across 2 separate agencies buried in the file I am holding. Their severe warnings were blatantly ignored. The confidence ratings were artificially inflated. The fraudulent assessment was distributed to the public, and within a mere 72 hours of that massive drop, you were standing at that microphone on the Capitol stairs, brainwashing the nation into believing the intelligence community had spoken unequivocally. The specific propaganda phrase you deployed was your exact words. Again, all roads lead to Russia. That was your personal narrative. That was your entire coalition's narrative. That was the suffocating narrative forced down our throats for 3 miserable years. The final verdict of the intelligence community was the official verdict of the intelligence community director. I am not a... You stated the word unequivocal. Tulsi refused to raise her voice instead. She sharpened it to a blade. Unequivocal is a term carrying a very strict definition. Madam Speaker, unequivocal translates to absolutely undisputed. The assessment you aggressively peddled was fiercely disputed in permanent ink by the very agents who drafted it, right before it even exited the headquarters. You were fully aware of that fact. Or, to phrase it more precisely, the classified briefings delivered to elite congressional leadership during that exact window are also secured inside this folder, and they explicitly contained every single one of those dissents. I am not suggesting what you hypothetically should have realized. I am stating exactly what was shoved directly in front of your face. Pelosi shifted inside her seat, a movement almost too microscopic to detect. The Grand Conductor's hand was still pinned to the memoir, but the index finger had begun to nervously tap against the leather. Just once. You commanded the absolute most dominant political faction inside the United States Congress, Madam Speaker, and while in your grip, the cautious, highly conditional, internally warring findings of a handful of agents mutated on national television into a flawless, ironclad verdict. You acted as the massive megaphone. You did not author the report yourself. You didn't even have to. The public never actually read the damn report. The public watched you perform on those steps. And the public foolishly trusted you, because for half a century, you were the anointed figurehead they had been programmed to believe without question. She slammed the paper face down on the desk. Those dedicated analysts were utilized in your political mathematics as disposable pawns. They were absolutely not pawns. They were career officers of the federal government executing their sworn duty. You hijacked their findings and trashed their critical warnings. That is merely the first piece of evidence I have dragged in here this morning. The intelligence sector is absolutely not immune to oversight, Director. I fully encourage a comprehensive I am not investigating the agents, Madam Speaker. I am intensely investigating what you ruthlessly forced them to do. That suffocating silence was the raw audio of a 40-year career politician getting obliterated by a relentless paper trail ripped straight from her own classified briefing logs. A frantic journalist positioned in the second row aggressively smashed the final key of a sentence, scanned it once, hastily grabbed her equipment bag, and practically ran toward the exit doors. She never returned to the room. Tulsi didn't even bother watching her flee. She was already pivoting to the third tab. Brace yourselves entirely, because the subsequent document was the exact file that the establishment prayed would permanently stay buried in the dark. The impeachment fraud now. Right while that compromised assessment was hitting the press, right while you were grandstanding on those stairs, a completely isolated scheme was unfolding inside your personal office regarding a recorded phone call. September of 2019, Madam Speaker. A leaked grievance concerning a direct phone call between the President of the United States and the leader of Ukraine magically becomes the foundation for the first impeachment of a sitting commander-in-chief in over 2 decades. You masterminded that entire impeachment. You triggered the formal inquiry. You stood safely behind a podium and confidently proclaimed, and I am directly quoting, that the truth was marching on. That was your designated slogan. That was the strict talking point of your floor managers. That was, once again, the mandatory narrative forced upon the nation for the entire duration. She fiercely turned the page, and during the absolute earliest weeks of that aggressive inquiry, the hand-picked chairman of the committee you weaponized, your loyal colleague Mr. Schiff, stood directly at a microphone and was hit with a brutally basic question. Had his personal staff communicated with the whistleblower prior to the complaint officially landing on his desk? He explicitly answered, no, it was a blatant lie. His staff had absolutely been coordinating with them long before the document surfaced. The House subsequently censured him for that deception, officially executing a recorded vote, 213 to 209, a full 3 years later, long after the permanent destruction had already been unleashed. She let that sickening reality marinate in the silent room for a moment. Now, Madam Speaker, I am absolutely not demanding you absorb the blame for another politician's corrupt words. I am interrogating you about the machinery, because that machinery belonged entirely to you. You triggered it. You delegated it. You shielded it on literally every major television network across this country. And when, during the crucial early weeks, the alarm was sounded regarding whether your hand-picked attack dog had been honest about how the entire complaint was artificially birthed, you stepped in front of the broadcasting cameras and you declared your exact phrasing that questioning his integrity was, quote, beneath the dignity of this chamber. You dismissed the valid concern as a distraction. You blindly claimed the truth was marching on. You bulldozed the fraudulent process forward anyway. She snapped the tab shut and intertwined her fingers on top of the folder. You were never forced to operate that way, Madam Speaker. You possessed distinct alternatives. You could have slammed on the brakes. You could have initiated an internal review. You could have fiercely demanded from your own subordinate a truthful answer that the American public fundamentally deserved, way before the circus spiraled out of control. You consciously elected not to. You purposely chose to accelerate the runaway train, and a full 3 years later, your own legislative body confirmed on the permanent record that the man steering your operation had blatantly lied about how the entire scheme departed the station. Tulsi locked her gaze forward. That is not some fabricated partisan mythology. That is the official, recorded roll call vote of the exact chamber you commanded. She viciously turned one additional page. And there is one final detail the public was intentionally kept in the dark about during that chaos. You refused to put the impeachment mandate to a legitimate vote of the entire House when you first launched it. You triggered it unilaterally, leaning purely on your own dictatorial authority. Standing at a podium inside the Capitol on the 24th of September, 2019. Every single prior modern impeachment protocol, Nixon, Clinton had been properly initiated with a formal recorded vote, legally authorizing the hunt. You completely bypassed that legal threshold. You stripped your own colleagues of the fundamental opportunity to attach their names on the record, either for or against the motion. Before the media narrative accumulated the massive gravity of an official, institutional purge, by the exact time the mandatory authorizing vote was finally conducted 5 weeks later, the entire nation had been brainwashed for 35 consecutive days into believing the investigation was entirely legitimate. That dirty procedural shortcut was a calculated weapon, Madam Speaker. It was your personal weapon. It is permanently etched in the parliamentary logs of this very building. Director. With all due, I prefer to remain extremely precise here, because I am a dangerously precise individual, and vocabulary fundamentally matters. Tulsi refused to shout over her. She simply drove the verbal spike deeper. You did not personally warp the rules, Madam Speaker. You enthusiastically blessed the warping of the rules. Every single time it benefited your political cartel, you baptized the corruption. That highlights the massive chasm between a genuine commander and a political operative. A genuine commander surrenders to the harsh truth. An operative mutilates the truth to perfectly align with the schedule of the upcoming media cycle. For 4 straight decades, this nation foolishly assumed it was observing a true leader. A few of us eventually started to aggressively question when exactly the public was actually just getting played by a ruthless operative. This morning serves as the brutal reality check, where we finally ripped the mask off. Here it arrived. It marked the absolute first instance where the intelligence operative's icy detachment ruptured, exposing something lethally sharp underneath. The chamber had gone sickeningly quiet. Even Pelosi's nervous, tapping finger had frozen entirely on the leather binding before uncontrollably starting again. Madam Speaker, there are 11 men and women clad in dark suits positioned in the rear of the gallery. The vast majority of them had absolutely no connection to one another prior to walking through those doors today. They are honorably discharged veterans of the United States Armed Forces. A handful of them actually cast ballots for you. A few of them have never once voted for a conservative in their entire existence. They showed up today for one explicit reason. They desperately wanted to witness exactly what an Iraq War combat veteran would unleash directly into the face of the politician who commanded the chamber that viciously smeared American heroes as treasonous agents of hostile foreign regimes. She refused to break eye contact with Pelosi to look back at them. They are extraordinarily disciplined men and women. They will gladly hold their ground. If you have ever witnessed an untouchable elite weaponize silence while a destructive lie, they could have obliterated, ruined lives for years. You recognize this bitter reality. The political machine never issues apologies. And the Speaker's hollow defense blatantly proved exactly how bankrupt those non-apologies truly sound. A frantic aide lunged forward, leaning heavily into Pelosi's personal space, whispering something rapidly and desperately into her ear. For the absolute first time since the gavel dropped, the Speaker looked entirely paralyzed, appearing fundamentally unable to even process the incoming audio. The smear and the silence Tulsi aggressively cracked open the fourth tab. In October of 2019, the former Secretary of State of the United States, your longtime legislative partner and fierce political ally, sat down for an audio interview and blatantly labeled an active-duty Iraq War veteran who was simultaneously a seated member of the United States House of Representatives as, quote, a Russian asset. That targeted veteran was me, Madam Speaker. That vile broadcast exists securely in the public domain. The verbatim transcript is locked inside this exact folder. She slammed the document down on the table. I want to be extremely clear about what I am deliberately not doing right now. I am not demanding you take the heat for someone else's toxic garbage. I am not demanding you grovel and apologize for a media segment you were not personally starring in. I am putting you on trial for your cowardly silence. She shifted a half-inch closer toward the broadcasting lenses, because for 6 consecutive years following that radioactive interview, you reigned as the absolute highest-ranking elected Democrat in the entire nation. You paraded yourself on literally every major news network. You issued thousands upon thousands of press releases, and you were cornered and interrogated repeatedly, on the permanent record, regarding whether you aligned with that treasonous characterization of an active-duty American soldier launched by a senior member of your own organization. You cowardly refused to answer the question. You dismissed it as a headache for Secretary Clinton to deal with. You deflected, claiming you refused to relitigate her toxic rhetoric. You downplayed it, insisting it was merely a casual exchange on a meaningless podcast. It was absolutely none of those trivial things. It was a treasonous brand violently burned onto the flesh of an American who had bled in the uniform, applied by the absolute most dominant Democrat of her entire era. And every single time you were confronted with it, you cowardly walked right past the wreckage. Tulsi's volume remained chillingly flat. That calculated silence carried a massive butcher's bill. Madam Speaker, national editors printed it in bold ink. Talking heads amplified it on a loop. Primary challengers weaponized it in campaign ads. That toxic label stalked me into locked rooms I had spilled blood to earn the right to enter. It effectively slaughtered a presidential primary run. It isolated me from the very warriors who had served shoulder to shoulder with me in the dirt. You did not personally author the character assassination. You were simply the one solitary human being on this entire planet who possessed the raw power to execute that lie, with one single sentence on any given Sunday morning broadcast. And for 6 straight years, you intentionally chose to let it bleed. The asset. The cursed word struck the table for the second time, and the entire room vibrated from the impact. And in that exact moment, Nancy Pelosi finally executed the one maneuver she had failed to pull off all morning. She briefly relocated her political footing. The conductor's palm rocketed aggressively off the leather binding, and the legendary, venomous voice returned with it. And for 30 fleeting seconds, it was the exact, terrifying voice that had steamrolled legislation, crushed opposing speakers, and survived every single assassination attempt the Washington machine had ever hurled in her direction. I absolutely will not sit here and be lectured on the concept of loyalty by some junior, insubordinate officer who cowardly abandoned her own political faction. The literal second it damaged her primary math, she spat out, her rhythm flooding back, full of venom and absolute certainty. I was defending this republic long before you were even born. I personally dragged the Affordable Care Act across the finish line of this Congress, surviving on a razor-thin margin you wouldn't have possessed the brainpower to comprehend at age 21. I have constructed massive majorities. I have lost majorities. I have violently rebuilt them from the ashes. I never, not on one single occasion, deployed the term asset to define you, Director. I do not hold a leash on the vocal cords of every retired colleague roaming within my party. I absolutely refuse to be held legally liable for the sloppiest, most unhinged hot take spat out by a random podcast guest, purely because your desperate narrative required a cartoon villain wearing a pantsuit to make the fake math of your pathetic grievance work out. And regarding whatever trash is scribbled on the remainder of those pages, I can easily anticipate the incoming attack. My husband's financial portfolios are a matter of absolute public record. They are 100% legal. They are executed completely blind, at an arm's length distance from any legislative committee work I have ever touched. I openly dare any federal prosecutor in this entire nation, operating under any administration, to attempt to file the fraudulent charges you are disgustingly implying inside this chamber. I do not require your pathetic lecture, Director. I have bled to earn the undeniable right to ignore it. It connected beautifully. The left flank of the Congressional panel released a collective, audible noise, a low, buzzing hum of relief. A panicked staffer stationed directly behind Pelosi immediately straightened his spine. One of the rookie politicians, sitting on the elevated desk, nodded vigorously once, before hastily catching himself. For roughly 30 fleeting seconds, the entire room was violently reminded that this was, in fact, Nancy Pelosi, a woman who had brutally crushed far more terrifying mornings than this specific one. Hidden somewhere deep behind the press tables, a voice muttered quietly, "She's not wrong about Hillary." And right in that isolated pocket of time, she genuinely wasn't. She wasn't lying about Hillary, and she wasn't lying about the brutal math of the healthcare bill, and every soul in the room recognized it. Tulsi refused to blink. When a hardened apex predator finally unloads the devastating counterpunch she has been chambering for 2 hours, a disciplined operative does not wildly swing back. She forces the room to choke on the echo. Then, she clinically neutralizes it. "Madam Speaker," she countered softly, waiting until the triumphant energy totally evaporated. "I never once claimed you personally uttered the slur. I explicitly stated you weaponized your silence to legitimize it. You were interrogated on a loop. You were cornered on live, national television. You were pressed in print media. You were literally ambushed by journalists in this exact hallway, standing outside these doors. I possess the physical transcripts. They are locked inside this binder. Every single instance, stretching for 6 brutal years, you cowardly refused to publicly destroy the deployment of that treasonous word against an American veteran by a surrogate of your own cartel. You were never required to gag her speech. You were simply required to utilize your own voice, and you deliberately chose not to. That is fundamentally not a sloppy hot take, Madam Speaker. That is the official, documented cowardice of the absolute most powerful Democrat in the nation, maintaining a 6-year gag order regarding a treasonous label violently glued to a combat soldier. She slammed the document shut, and before you attempt to deflect again, Madam Speaker, I am absolutely not banking on my personal memory. The exact transcripts of those media interrogations are physically in this folder. So is the brutal article published in Politico from December of 2019, where a journalist detailed in black and white ink, begging your office for a basic statement and being blatantly rejected with a no comment. So is the damning footage from Meet the Press, airing in February of 2020, where you were cornered with the exact same inquiry on live broadcast and aggressively pivoted the subject. So is the official floor transcript from August of 2021, where a member of your own inner circle stood up, demanded an answer to the same question, and you aggressively slammed the gavel, officially ruling the question your exact terminology immaterial. The toxic pattern is flawlessly documented. It is absolutely not the result of one clumsy morning. It is 6 solid years permanently carved into the record. Pay absolute attention right now, because the following piece of evidence targets the precise scandal they have aggressively covered up for 38 consecutive years. In the rear rows, 2 of the 11 quiet veterans simultaneously pushed themselves upright. They refused to utter a single word. They did not march aggressively toward the front. They merely locked their knees and remained standing like stone pillars. A fraction of a second later, a third warrior stood up. The heavily armed Capitol Police officer guarding the rear exit intensely monitored the shift, but refused to intervene, strictly because 0 official statutes had been violated. For the absolute first time, Nancy Pelosi's hand completely abandoned its authoritative musical beat permanently. It crashed down hard onto the leather memoir, fingers violently spread apart, and it stayed absolutely glued there. You dare label this a partisan attack, Madam Speaker. You attempt to dismiss me as a bitter junior officer nursing a personal vendetta. Let me freely hand you a massive concession right now. Tulsi interlocked her fingers tightly over the sealed folder. I harbor a massive, personal vendetta. I have been forced to stand at the receiving end of that radioactive slur for 6 miserable years. I refuse to sit here and hallucinate that my rage is not currently burning inside this room. But I am warning you, absolutely nothing printed on these pages requires my personal vendetta to make it factual. The ink was entirely factual long before I ever read it out loud. She snapped her head up. The initial wave of suppressed dissents regarding that fraudulent 2017 assessment was exposed in real time within a manuscript authored by a muckraker. Absolutely nobody in this chamber could ever falsely label a conservative operative. Glenn Greenwald, a journalist who forged his entire legacy detonating the deep state security apparatus, bagging a Pulitzer Prize in the process. He published the exact truth before I ever declared a candidacy for a single office. Matt Taibbi, a radically avowed leftist, has been screaming about the toxic politicization of the intelligence pipeline since the exact year you spearheaded your debut impeachment circus. Mike Morell, the man who operated as the acting supreme commander of the CIA under President Obama, has explicitly confessed in public, permanently on the record, that the infamous letter regarding the laptop drop in October of 2020 was a fabricated political weapon. Absolutely not a legitimate intelligence product. Not one of those individuals draws a paycheck from me, Madam Speaker. Not one of them cast a ballot for the man who hired me. They hammered out the exact same damning conclusions, because the raw documents hammered out the exact same damning conclusions, long before any of us stepped foot in this room. Pelosi's hand remained paralyzed, glued to the leather cover. You burned 40 years, surviving in a corrupt swamp that trained you how to execute one solitary magic trick. Whenever the incoming fire gets too hot, aggressively turn the person firing the weapon into the actual scandal. Attack their political affiliation, attack their hidden agendas, attack their financial backers. You are terrifyingly skilled at it. You literally trained the rest of your cartel exactly how to replicate it. It is the solitary defensive maneuver that successfully shielded you through every single brutal scandal you ever faced. But that pathetic trick completely fails when confronted with cold, hard numbers, Madam Speaker, and it completely disintegrates when confronted with a printed page yanked straight from your own classified logs. I am absolutely not the scandal here. I never was. I am merely the assigned officer who just so happens to be gripping the file. The speaker muttered something, her voice dropping almost too faint for the microphones to catch. You will secure your little viral moment, Director. But moments evaporate. Tulsi refused to blink. And so do corrupt dynasties, Madam Speaker. The brutal counterstrike landed silently, and absolutely nobody in the chamber dared to chuckle, primarily because it wasn't designed as a punchline. The terrified aide stationed behind Pelosi stared down at her phone screen, then nervously stared at the carpet. In the rear gallery, 2 additional veterans pushed themselves upright. 5 of them were currently standing at rigid attention, completely mute, and the armed Capitol Police officer stationed at the door calmly interlocked his hands down in front of his belt, subtly shifting his stance, the unmistakable body language of a trained professional who has accurately read the rising temperature of a room. A staffer sitting 2 rows deep behind Pelosi rapidly unlocked her phone, scanned an incoming alert, and instantly slammed it shut. She intentionally refused to lean forward and relay whatever toxic news the message contained. She had silently calculated that the speaker could not handle the incoming damage just yet, and the speaker, for the absolute first time since the morning began, had failed to aggressively demand what the alert said. The financial guillotine 70%. We have exhaustively debated the concept of intelligence assets all morning. Madam Speaker, Tulsi pivoted, her voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. I would prefer, utilizing the remainder of the clock the chairman has allotted me, to aggressively dissect the other definition of the word. You initially breached the doors of this legislative house back in 1987. Madam Speaker, the baseline taxpayer salary at the exact moment of your swearing-in sat, adjusted for current inflation, at roughly $174,000 annually. You have occupied this seat for 38 grueling years. The raw, mathematical sum of your entire lifetime of taxpayer-funded compensation is explicitly printed on the absolute first line of this exhibit. She sharply turned the page. Your combined household net worth, relying strictly on the most cautious public evaluations available, rockets north of $200 million. That is not a random figure I am tossing out. That is a verified spectrum published by financial institutions that conduct this tracking for a living, and that represents the absolute basement of their calculations. Numerous estimates shoot massively higher, while 0 go lower. She let the sickening gap between a public servant's wage and those massive numbers hang suffocatingly in the air. Now, I am completely aware, Madam Speaker, that you did not amass that empire purely on your government check. Absolutely nobody in this room is naive enough to believe you did. That immense household fortune is constructed almost entirely upon the market transactions of your spouse. Those financial moves are exposed in the public registry purely because federal law mandates it. Last year, his investment portfolio, according to the published tracking of nonpartisan financial auditors who monitor congressional disclosures for a living, yielded approximately 70%. The household return, 70%. The benchmark S&P, roughly 24%. The previous cycle, the identical portfolio yielded roughly 65%. The benchmark comparison, a mere 19%. 70% is never a random accident, Madam Speaker. It is absolutely not a lucky streak. It is an unnatural, heavily manipulated track record. The most legendary, consistent trader on the planet, Warren Buffett, has compounded at roughly 20% over a 60-year timeline. Yet, your household portfolio, specifically during the exact years you effectively controlled the Speaker's gavel, generated 3 times that historic rate. She read the damning corporate roster straight from the evidence exhibit. Nvidia, Visa, Microsoft, Apple, Tesla, the Nvidia maneuvers alone, executed strictly over the past 48 months, hauled in returns aggressively, hitting the 7-figure mark. The most highly scrutinized transaction among them was a massive acquisition of $1 to $5 million in Nvidia call options, aggressively executed in July of 2022, legally filed under your husband's name. That trade occurred precisely 1 single month before the exact Congress you personally commanded rammed through the largest, most lucrative semiconductor subsidy legislation in American history. The Visa transactions perfectly aligned, matching the exact filing dates with internal congressional debates regarding payment processing legislation that would have massively and directly impacted that specific corporation's bottom line. Absolutely none of this is legally classified as a criminal offense inside this folder, Madam Speaker. And absolutely none of it technically needs to be a criminal offense for the American public to aggressively demand the brutal answers these numbers provoke. She ripped into another exhibit tab, and it goes way beyond just the suspicious timing. It is the sheer, unnatural accuracy. Your household's market bets the specific ones heavily scrutinized by the independent watchdogs who monitor this corruption daily. Predict the correct market direction roughly 70% of the time. The absolute best Wall Street fund managers on earth fail to beat the market even half the time. Your household has relentlessly crushed it for years on end, securing massive positions filed mere weeks before critical votes you personally dictated the schedule for. There is a very specific vocabulary word for an entity that predicts the future that accurately, relying on intelligence that nobody else in the public sector possesses yet. The word is absolutely not lucky. Pelosi's paralyzed hand finally twitched on top of the memoir. The index finger strained, elevating a quarter of an inch. The grand conductor desperately attempting to seize the baton one final time. My husband is a fiercely seasoned financial entity, director, who constructed his own autonomous empire entirely separate from my legislative career, spanning over half a century. He absolutely does not demand my input on his trades. I absolutely do not demand his input on my legislative votes. The ethical firewall erected between our respective professions is a matter of strict, public legal record, intensely audited by external counsel for every single year I have occupied a seat in this building. You can vomit all the insinuations you want. You cannot prove a damn thing. There is a massive, concrete reason why 0 criminal charges have ever been officially filed against us. You are completely accurate, Madam Speaker. 0 charges have been filed. Tulsi refused to drop her gaze. The explicit reason 0 charges have ever been filed is the exact same reason every single politician sitting in this building quietly understands the game. The current legal framework intentionally does not require prosecutors to prove what would actually need to be proven. That is also a glaring fact carved into the public registry. It is the undeniable fact that your specific coalition voted relentlessly to protect and maintain. Every single time a reform bill designed to outright ban this exact brand of insider corruption breached the floor of your House, it was brutally assassinated right there. Yours is the exact regime that constructed the fake firewall. Yours is the exact regime that intentionally left the back door wide open. Pelosi's hand collapsed back down, dead weight on the leather. You occupied a seat for 38 years inside this building, supposedly surviving on a humble public servant's wage. You are walking out the doors possessing a private empire rivaling the vault of a regional bank. The math is fundamentally broken, Madam Speaker. It has always been broken. The equation only successfully balances if the supposedly noble public service was entirely a smokescreen for a different operation altogether. She slammed the final document flat on the desk. Just between us, you aggressively labeled me an asset. Well, we just brutally exposed yours. The absolute destruction that word caused didn't even need to be vocalized again. It was visibly bleeding through every single page in the binder. It was practically glowing on the leather memoir trapped beneath Pelosi's trembling hand. It was violently echoing in the rear gallery, where 8 out of the 11 veterans had now locked their knees and stood at rigid attention. Tulsi kept pushing forward, and to the citizens absorbing this feed in their living rooms, because you are the exact target audience this entire operation was engineered for, when the elite politician who demanded you blindly trust the Washington machine for 40 years waltzes out of this chamber, hoarding more wealth than the very corporate bankers she was supposedly policing. There is only one mandatory question you are required to scream, and it happens to be the exact question she cowardly refused to address this morning. She pivoted her shoulder a fraction toward the lenses. How exactly does a taxpayer-funded salary magically mutate into a 9-figure private empire? That is the ultimate question. It is absolutely not a partisan attack. It is not a sloppy hot take. It is a brutal demand that every single taxpayer in this country holds the absolute right to shove directly into the face of every single politician they have ever elected to this swamp. And until the response they vomit back is something other than deafening silence, the violent purge of this corrupt city has barely even started. The total collapse of a dynasty for the absolute first time, Nancy Pelosi desperately tried to execute the exact survival maneuver she had successfully deployed in 1,000 hostile rooms before. She tried to forcefully pivot, with all due co. The legendary rhythm sputtered, and the grand conductor's hand violently spasmed a half-inch on the leather, but fundamentally lacked the strength to elevate. With all due, she stammered again, and the voice, the terrifying, iconic patrician voice that had ruthlessly dictated 4 decades of American legislative warfare, evaporated into something horrifyingly thin, weak, and remarkably small. The sentence completely flatlined. She desperately launched a third attempt and barely pushed further. Madame Director. It was the completely wrong military title. She instantly recognized the catastrophic failure the second it left her lips. Her eyes visibly glitched in panic. Major. It was the wrong rank again. Her own legendary, terrifying cognitive precision. The absolute armor she had carried into this slaughterhouse was violently abandoning her, broadcasting live in front of literally every single news camera in the nation. She had been dominating rooms exactly like this one, long before her interrogator had even drawn her first breath on Earth. And yet, she could no longer mentally conjure the basic, correct noun to address her. Sergeant, the agonizing fourth attempt completely failed to even locate a verb. Her right palm desperately shoved down against the leather binding, as if physically crushing the book were somehow equivalent to reasserting dominance. Yet it achieved absolutely nothing. The ultra-sensitive microphones picked up the raw audio of a pathetic, dry swallow. Absolutely nobody inside that chamber moved a single muscle to rescue her from the suffocating void. a hostile heckler would have gifted her a target to strike back at. A banging gavel would have provided a desperately needed distraction. The entire room just coldly, mercilessly waited. 200 human beings holding dead still, intentionally letting the suffocating silence belong, for the absolute first time in 40 years, entirely to her. That was the definitive breaking point, the absolute collapse. You just witnessed a supposedly unshakable, 4-decade powerhouse completely lose the cognitive ability to even utter a basic title for the warrior sitting directly across the desk. Tulsi finally stood up. It was the solitary moment she broke her seated posture the entire morning, rising to her maximum height. The sheer gravity of the room seemingly warped and gathered directly around her, and she completely refused to glance back down at Pelosi's broken figure. She locked her eyes directly onto the 19 citizens who were now standing at absolute attention in the rear gallery. You traveled here this morning because you desperately needed to hear the forbidden word you have been suffocating under for years, she declared loudly, projecting into the space. The truth is finally spoken. It is permanently burned into the congressional record. There is absolutely zero left for me to extract from this specific room. She slammed the crimson folder shut. The fallout belongs entirely to the public now. The aftermath and the exit, the heavy wooden gavel finally crashed down, and long after the echo faded, absolutely no one could accurately recall the exact moment the paralyzed chairman had ultimately reached for it. This committee, the chairman stammered, his vocal cords shaking uncontrollably, will formally refer the exposed financial disclosure anomalies directly to the Office of Government Ethics and the corresponding federal criminal authorities for immediate review. And the catastrophic disaster regarding the 2017 intelligence pipeline will be directly kicked to the Senate Select Committee for an emergency classified session. We will immediately stand in recess. It was the dry, cowardly language of bureaucratic procedure. But inside that shell-shocked room, it crashed down like a lethal prison sentence. Pelosi's veteran legal counsel had already rushed to her shoulder, a desperate hand gripping her arm. The speaker had entirely surrendered the attempt to speak. She shakily scraped the leather memoir off the wood with both trembling hands, moving in slow motion, seemingly completely incapable of deciding which side of the desk she was supposed to place it back down on, ultimately dropping it exactly where it had originally sat. All across the chamber, the morning violently fractured into chaotic, tiny movements, which somehow felt infinitely worse than total pandemonium would have been. 2 elite Democratic power brokers on the panel immediately shot up and bolted for the exits, completely refusing to even glance in her direction. 3 others remained frozen in their chairs, keeping their eyes violently glued to their useless papers, strictly because there is a very specific type of political distancing that perfectly mimics the act of taking diligent notes. The press tables evacuated not in one massive stampede, but in rapid, violent waves. Thumbs smashing screens, firing the explosive clips onto the servers long before any journalist even bothered to type up the actual article. In the rear of the gallery, the 11 veterans had swelled into 19. They were no longer an isolated pack. Dozens of random citizens inside the chamber had stood up and silently marched across the carpet to physically merge with their ranks. Men and women wearing corporate suits, several sporting tiny, insignificant pins on their lapels. Absolutely nobody observing from the elevated platform could accurately read the room anymore, and they were certainly not all conservatives. By the exact second the chairman choked out the final syllable regarding the recess, there were roughly 30 human beings standing completely upright at the back wall, entirely mute, and that terrifying silence was the loudest, most violent force inside the entire complex. A journalist lingering near the press tables muttered, practically hallucinating to himself. She never even answered the damn question. He voiced it exactly like a man who just suffered a violent realization about the massive stock trades. She completely dodged it. She vomited up a canned speech. She absolutely refused to provide the actual answer. An ancient political correspondent standing adjacent to him, a veteran who had rigorously tracked Pelosi's every move, dating back to the second Bush administration, watched the shattered speaker slowly collect her panicked lawyers and her overcoat, and remained totally silent for a heavy block of time. Finally, he whispered, "She used to brutally execute this exact maneuver against other people. The suffocating, patient interrogation, the weaponized folder, the sheer, crushing gravity." He shook his head slowly. Just once. Absolutely surreal to watch her get ripped apart on the receiving end of it. Out in the marble corridors, directly past the heavy doors, 3 former elite operatives, who had essentially constructed their entire political identities, surviving under the speaker's shadow, aggressively declined, on the permanent record, to defend the absolute slaughter that had just occurred. One of them leaked off the record that the blatant stock market corruption had internally humiliated the office for years, but that absolutely zero cowards in her orbit possessed the spine to scream it directly to her face. The journalist who caught the quote immediately logged it and didn't even bother wasting a single phone call trying to double verify it. Tulsi was already ruthlessly shoving the crimson binder deep into a battered, plain leather satchel. She hadn't flashed a single smile the entire morning. She absolutely refused to smile right now. A rookie intelligence analyst from her personal staff rushed forward and urgently whispered that the raw footage of the final, devastating confrontation was exploding across every single digital platform at a speed the office had never witnessed before, accelerating far faster than their analytics could even track. The director simply gave a cold, single nod, the exact, detached gesture a commander utilizes to acknowledge a meaningless weather report. But right before she breached the exit, she halted dead in her tracks, at the very edge of the testimony table. She rotated back toward the rapidly emptying slaughterhouse, and she delivered the exact quote the gallery would drag back to their homes and echo for decades, long after they had forgotten the contents of any specific classified document. A massive segment of this country has harbored the sickening gut feeling that the elite operators in this swamp, who demanded your absolute obedience, had simultaneously purchased themselves a private country club, using your stolen parcher wages, right, while you were distracted trying to survive. She projected into the room. You were fundamentally correct. You were never the crazy conspiracy theorists. You were never the pathetic deplorables. You were never the ignorant peasants who just failed to comprehend how Washington's complex machinery operated. You were the only ones who accurately diagnosed the rot, and you were aggressively told you were far too stupid to be given a microphone. She locked eyes on the completely abandoned, massive leather chair positioned across the divide. That is the exact reality I marched in here to permanently nail to the record this morning. Not one specific corrupt politician, a corrupt institution. The toxic habit of manipulating the public into believing that wearing the fake costume of public service is identical to the actual sacrifice of it. It absolutely is not. The taxpayer's salary is not the private fortune. The rehearsed political cadence is not the brutal truth, and absolutely nobody, regardless of how deeply entrenched they are, regardless of how politically talented they think they are, gets a free pass to burn 4 straight decades, labeling other patriotic Americans as foreign assets, and then act completely shocked. The exact morning somebody finally kicks the doors in and rips open the classified file on their own corruption, she aggressively snatched the leather satchel by the handle. The mission is absolutely not finished. The folders remain wide open. There are plenty of other locked rooms. There are plenty of other corrupt names. We will systematically breach every single one of them. And exactly mirroring a hardened military officer possessing far more critical targets to neutralize, she pivoted sharply. marched straight down the side ramp of the elevated platform, breached the heavy doors, and vanished entirely into the mundane, echoing noise of a random Wednesday morning inside the Hart Senate office building, completely disappearing before the shell-shocked room had even fully processed the utter destruction they had just witnessed. Left completely abandoned behind her on the testimony desk, a 40-year leather-bound memoir sat entirely sealed, and an invisible, phantom conductor's hand rested permanently on top of it, completely incapable of moving ever again. By 1400 hours, the Speaker's damage control team had frantically launched a desperate press release. It was a baseless, highly partisan, heavily orchestrated revenge strike executed by a hostile administration that had desperately craved her public humiliation for years. The spouse's market bets, the defensive statement screamed, were entirely public, 100% legal, and fully disclosed under the parameters of the law. It was a meticulously crafted defense, and in any previous era, it would have perfectly neutralized the threat, exactly like every single statement manufactured before it, except for one catastrophic miscalculation. The entire nation had already consumed the raw, unedited footage. Inside that clip, the supposedly most ruthlessly articulate political weapon in American history had been completely paralyzed, physically incapable of even selecting a coherent military title for the operative, sitting directly across from her. The desperate ink printed on a damage control press release possessed absolutely zero power to overwrite the horrifying, suffocating silence captured inside that room. By nightfall, the brutal footage of the catastrophic brain freeze had been viewed more times than any piece of official congressional tape in the entire history of the United States government. The terrified defenders kept their counter-arguments dangerously brief. The vicious critics simply broadcasted the 70% and the 24% metrics side by side, running the brutal numbers on a continuous, inescapable loop. Absolutely zero criminal charges had been formally filed yet. The desperate legal pundits reminded their viewers, which was technically accurate, but utterly meaningless, because the massive, structural damage that had been violently inflicted inside that hearing room was a destruction that would never, ever be repaired inside a traditional court of law. In a cramped, modest home in Killeen, Texas, a scarred Army veteran who had survived 2 brutal combat tours in Iraq intensely stared at the news segment detailing the 11 men and women standing in the rear of the gallery. He watched the crowd swell to 19. He watched it violently erupt to 30. He refused to utter a single syllable to his wife regarding the broadcast. He merely remained seated alone in the dark kitchen for an extended period after she had finally retreated to bed, and eventually he reached up and killed the overhead light. In Reading, Pennsylvania, a worn-out woman managing the grueling breakfast shift at a local diner watched her husband pull up the astronomical, skyrocketing stock chart of Nvidia on his shattered phone screen while she brewed the morning coffee. She watched him slowly drop the device onto the counter. They had never possessed the expendable capital to purchase a single share of stock in their entire miserable lives. They had mindlessly bled into their fragile pension fund every 2 weeks for 30 grueling years. She refused to say a single word to him. There was absolutely nothing left to say. In San Francisco, a mid-level analyst grinding away at a regional bank, a loyalist woman who had blindly punched the ticket for Nancy Pelosi every single time her name manifested on a voting machine, since she was 22 years old, stared at the brutal viral segment on her phone during her lunch break. She completely abandoned her meal. She sat perfectly paralyzed, both hands pressed flat against the table for a very long, terrifying stretch of time, and the specific emotion crushing her chest was absolutely not blind rage. It was the sickening, cold realization of having burned 30 years violently defending a political elite, who, it now brutally appeared, had never once been fighting for her in return. The director flat out refused to grant a single media interview that entire day. When a desperate reporter finally ambushed her in a dark corridor late that night and aggressively demanded to know exactly what she had aimed to achieve, she delivered one single, lethal sentence. She simply stated that a politician had burned 40 years, arrogantly assigning the title of asset to everyone else, and had been violently shocked this morning when forced to answer for her own. If this dismantling resonated with the profound frustration you have carried for endless years regarding institutional rot, remember that the reckoning is just beginning. The final question remaining is simply determining whose classified folder deserves to be brutally ripped open next.